Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of two at the Tottenham Way podcast during this international break. Next week, we have a Tom Barkley draft special, and I know you've been waiting for the best part of a year for one of those, so your patience is about to be rewarded. We're going to assess the Daniel Levy era. We are going to select the best 11 players bought by Tottenham under his guidance. We should also have a close look at some of the less good players who arrived during his 24 years in charge and some of the other incidents, a few happy, some less happy, that have preoccupied us all for most of the 21st century. So do join us for that. But this edition is all about the first few weeks of the 2025-26 season and includes some really interesting correspondence from some invested followers of this pod. And thank you very much for all your emails, your tweets, and everything else. We love to hear from you, as the boys always say. It's an interactive experience. You can email us at the Tottenham Way on X. We're also on Insta and on YouTube, of course. And as George was saying the other day, there is even talk of a TikTok appearance sooner rather than later. I'm Marcus Buckland. George Sessions from the Press Association is here, and so too is Tom Allnutt from The Times. So, guys, good evening. Let's just start with an early season report. Marks out of 10 for how Spurs have performed. Just to remind everybody, in the league, played 7, won 4, lost 1, drawn 2, plus 8 goal difference. Third best in the Premier League, scored 13, conceded 5, one League Cup victory. Relatively straightforward against Doncaster, a much tougher test to come at Newcastle, of course. And in the Champions League, one win, narrow win at home to Villarreal, and that rather difficult draw away to Bodo Glimt. And we've got a good question about points away from home in the Champions League a little later. But Tom, I mean, you're blessed along with the other Tom and with George in terms of going to all the press conferences, getting to know Thomas Frank. What have you made of the way he has settled into the role? And what have you made of the way he's turned out these Tottenham teams over the first few weeks of the season? Marks out of 10, please.
You love marks out of 10, Marcus.
Yes.
Always. This is your first opportunity of the season, I think, aren't we? 6 weeks in, and we're
Any
already
chance?
marks out of 10.
Any
I feel like
chance
I've
for a
just given
mark out
marks
of
out of
10?
10 for last season. That only feels like 2 weeks ago I did that. I feel like I listened to the pod of post Leeds and post Bodo that you guys did as well. A couple of really good reaction pods there. If people haven't listened to them already and they're stewing over the international break, definitely worth going and listening to George or post Leeds, definitely. But I thought you guys were being a little bit down in the dumps middle of last week. I've got to say, I thought after Bodo and post Wolves, thought you were starting to get a little bit tetchy, both of you. And I think it's been a good start, honestly. I think I would give it 8 out of 10, honestly. I mean, they've had, 10 games, if we're excluding the PSG match, which I tend to because it messes up all the statistics like clean sheets and things. So I say 10 games since PSG. They've lost one, they've lost one. They're third in the table. They're in all the cups. They're showing a lot of signs, I think, of improvements in key areas that we thought they were really lacking in last season. And I think if we're talking about impact from a manager, and it's very easy to look across the league and see other managers who have taken a lot longer to do a lot less at some very big clubs in the Premier League with a lot of money spent. You look at what Frank has already managed to do in terms of set pieces, resilience, defence, clean sheets, structure, to be honest, just solidity in the team and seriousness in the team. I think he's done a very good job, I think, so far. I'm not pretending to overlook, 2 or 3 of those performances, which certainly weren't great. It hasn't been, perfect all the way through, absolutely not. But if we'd said at the start of the season that Spurs would be still in all the competitions and they'd be third in the table and they'd racked up, 5 clean sheets or something out of 10 games, 1 defeat, I think we'd be pretty happy with that. So I think it's been a really good start, actually.
Okay, 8 out of 10, and an accusation, George, that you and I were tetchy a week or so ago. By the way, Tom, if you think we're tetchy, you wait till I come to an email from Jonathan Wood in a few moments' time. But we haven't been tetchy. I think we were a little frustrated, weren't we, after the Wolves and Bodo game? I thought we were very positive post Leeds.
Leeds was a great one, surely. We've got high expectations, Marcus. That's what it is. We've seen
We
a
have.
trophy, and now we want wins every Tuesday and Tuesday and Saturday. I think I would concur with that, actually, Tom. I was thinking 8 out of 10 myself. Yeah, there's been, 2 or 3 worrying performances, and results, we'll say, but on the whole, as you've kind of mentioned, I do include the PSG game. I think that was brilliant for 70, 80 minutes, wasn't it? And then it went downhill, but I do include that one. But yeah, 6 wins out of 11. Is it 7 unbeaten now, isn't it? Third in the Premier League going into October. 4 points in the Champions League, albeit I would have liked it to be 6. Can't sniff it. I know he's up at 4, can we? And through to the Carabao Cup next round. Yeah, I think Thomas Frank's started really, really well. We'll sort of get into the nitty gritty stuff, but I guess a couple of things early on that's really impressed me is probably how he's managed the squad already. It's kind of that balance, isn't it, between rotating players and playing your best team as well at the same time. And I think he's not always got that right, but I think actually in the long run, him making 4 or 5 changes every game, or every other game maybe, I think that's going to be really beneficial. So I've been impressed by how much of the squad he's used. People like Archie Graham, Matthias Tell have got plenty of minutes already, and I sort of wondered back in August how much opportunities they were going to get, and Wilson Odegaard's another one. So I think the way he's used the squad has been really, really impressive.
What I'm interested in, and as I always mention, you guys are privileged because you go to just about every press conference before, and you're at the game, and then you speak to Thomas afterwards. And I know that certainly from a journalistic point of view, you all loved Ange Postecoglou because he'd give you a story. Certainly, he was very expansive in his thoughts before a match, not necessarily quite as expansive afterwards as he was looking at his shoes. But I'm not going down that road again. But and I thought the one thing that really struck me after the Leeds game, which I really liked, and I didn't fully appreciate it until I watched the highlights again, was the way that the Spurs players went over to the fans. And of course, he particularly thrust Matthias Tell forward and said, you take your bow. You've had a lot of tough moments early in the season, and you deserve the applause. And that struck me as being fantastic man management. I just love the enthusiasm that he shows. Are we seeing the real Thomas Frank with these interviews? Is that what he's like every time you guys go up for the pre-match and indeed the post-match press conferences?
I really like that as well, Marcus. And I think what I liked about it is that it sort of made me think that actually Frank can bring that kind of Brentford community spirit to a club like Spurs. And actually, I think we've always been looking at it almost the other way, where we sort of think, can Frank deliver a big club, like Tottenham, where there's more expectation and, there's more noise, and the spending is more, everything is more, the expectations are more, of course. But actually, it sort of made me just kind of flip a little bit and think, actually, sometimes that kind of, I can't think of a better way to say it than a sort of small club mentality, in a nice way, where there's kind of like a closeness, an intimacy with the fans, and going over to the corner where the fans are all there. And of course, it helps when it's sort of an away support, I think, because it feels like there's that kind of intimacy with the travelling supporters in the corner. But just the way Frank kind of pushed Tell to the front there, the way all the players were there with him, the way he was leading from the front there, it just sort of, it made me think, this is Brentford Frank in charge of Tottenham, and it works. You don't have to sort of be a different manager just because you're in charge of a big team who want to qualify for the Champions League. It doesn't suddenly mean you have to be standoffish, and I think maybe I personally think Frank is really growing into the role. Like, I think in the first few days, maybe first few weeks is a fairer way to say it, I think he was slightly cagey, perhaps slightly nervous, keeping the media at a distance, at arm's length. But I mean, that doesn't matter. Like, that's neither here nor there really. It matters to us, but to nobody else. But I just sort of got the feeling that in general he was sort of finding his feet, and that he was quite keen not to make any mistakes. And to be honest, not in terms of tactics or in terms of his team selection or anything. It was just sort of his general demeanour. I felt was still someone, completely understandably, when you look at his career trajectory, was sort of realising that he was in the big time, if you like. And I think what I've really felt in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and perhaps it's because Spurs have, the results have come, the form has been pretty good. They're third in the table. I feel like he's suddenly really showing, actually, I deserve to be here. I belong here, and I'm happy to be myself in this role. And I think we've seen more and more, I don't know if George agrees, in press conferences, that he's starting just sort of to come out of his shell a bit. Because to be honest, and let's be honest here, as journalists, I think in the first month or so, it was quite challenging for us. I think in pressers, we sort of all had the idea that Frank would be very kind of open and friendly and chatty from the off, and it wasn't really like that. And to be fair, we had quite a lot of tough questions to ask, particularly in that first press conference about kind of Sonny's future, about Romero's future, about following Ange. It was all a little bit sort of prickly, and that was probably on us as much as it was on him. But I think it's taken a while for the sort of that kind of chemistry to develop, and I think in all ways, I think with the media and also perhaps with the fans, and I think I wouldn't say it's been a slow burn, but I really think in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I feel like he's really relaxing into it now. I mean, it's not to say it's all been perfect. We're not all best mates. So, there have been some slightly tough times, in the kind of pre-match presser before Bodo. I was sort of pushing Frank to basically tell us what the deal was with Romero's injury, because why wasn't he basically there? He's the Spurs captain, what's the deal? And he was, very pointedly saying, it's a precaution, is it a muscle injury or a knock? No, it's a precaution. Okay, fine, and it was slightly sort of tense, and we have had those moments, particularly, to be honest, on injuries. It was the same with Solanke a week or two before, and now we know why. The fitness issue, I think, with players is still a slightly kind of thorny subject. Frank hasn't really kind of he hasn't been keen to give good answers on those, but he's been very good on tactics, very good on players. And I think one other thing I would mention, what surprised me about him is actually he's quite tough. He's quite hard sometimes on players. And the obvious one was obviously that Basuma example where he disciplined him, very quickly. But there's also been, I don't know if George agrees with this, that we've had 3 or 4 times where we've asked him about Archie Gray or I don't know, Bergvall, for example, younger players, and we were kind of opening the way for him to sort of, give lots of easy praise. And he hasn't given praise easily, to be honest. I think sometimes people think of him as a very cuddly manager, but I've actually, I think in these opening weeks, really realised that there is very clearly quite a hard, ruthless streak, especially with his kind of demon headmaster eyes that he gives me when sometimes we ask questions that are tough and he sort of stares me down and you think, oh, and I imagine he's a bit like that with the players as well. Frank is not a cuddly coach. He's got a hard side as well.
Would you concur with that, George?
Yeah, I would. As soon as Tom started talking about press conferences, I did kind of go back to. I wasn't in Boda, but watching back that one was quite amusing. And it was a couple of press conferences before I think there was about 4 or 5 of us journalists that asked him about Dominic Solanke in different variations, and it was still the same answer: is it's not a big issue. It's fine. It's moved in the right direction, and then obviously he's had surgery. I do remember Frank being a little bit similar at Brentford. I didn't do loads of Brentford press conferences, but I remember doing some where he would say, "There's the squad is the same as as it was for the last game. No injuries." The next day, Christian Norgard's out for 3 months, and he'd be like, "Guys, I'm sorry, I've got to do this." And I think that we are going to find that as journalists throughout his time at Tottenham, which is hopefully a very long tenure, that he's just very reluctant to give details away when it comes to injuries and fitness. But I agree with Tom though. He's definitely opening up more. I guess some of my own personal ones. I think his first press conference, I asked him his kind of his sort of strongest memory of Tottenham. I didn't expect him to talk about waking up at 4 a.m. like Ange did and watching the 81 FA Cup final and UEFA Cup finals, but Frank just sort of gave a couple of lines about Alan Nielsen scoring in the 99 League Cup, and it was fine, but I just wanted him to sort of dive into it a bit more about kind of what that impact in Denmark. And we had a similar one about the Champions League, actually. He mentioned sort of the Barcelona-Sampdoria final as kind of a memorable one, but I just didn't get the sense that he was being that open and engaging. And sort of lately, I feel like he is speaking more willingly on topics. We asked him about Harry Kane a couple of, maybe about a week back, 2 weeks back, and he spoke for a long time about how himself and every Tottenham fan would want Harry Kane back. And I think we all kind of expected just a couple of lines about Harry Kane's a brilliant player, but I won't talk about him. And he really, really spoke openly about him. And I also asked him a lot of questions about Archie Gray the other week. And again, early on, it feels like he hasn't wanted to praise players and go too overboard, but he sort of willingly said, Archie has the same potential as Rodri and Declan Rice. So I definitely get the sense that he is settling into the role. And in fairness to him, we have had some other really interesting lines. The special operation one after PSG was a cracking line. So certainly from a kind of journalistic point of view, he's getting better, and I think fans want to see that as well. It isn't that important, is it, how he speaks in the media to us? But I think that is his platform to get his messages across to the fans, and if his answers are short and snappy and there's not much in them, I think fans can't connect with that. But it certainly feels to me that he's being more open, and I think fans will appreciate that.
Yeah, I just warmed to him, and it's really interesting, actually, Tom. You're saying there that actually there's a steely side. There has to be, of course, there has to be a steely side, but I sense there's a good heart there, and George makes the excellent point that a lot of the players have been used so far. He's been clever in that regard. At some point, of course, he's got to decide upon his best starting 11, particularly at home. And we'll come on to that in a moment. It's George, something that we touched on briefly after the Leeds game, but the issue is not the away performances. They've been excellent. It's how to be more creative, free-flowing, create the opportunities and score the goals to win on a regular basis in front of the Spurs fans. But not everyone is happy. And I'll just preface this email from Jonathan Wood by having a look at the teams that we have played so far this season. And yeah, the results are great. We have come up against the teams currently positioned 4th, 5th, 12th, 15th, 18th, 19th, and 20th. So, when you look at that, you have to accept that, okay, in terms of the fixtures themselves, it has been a relatively gentle start to the campaign. Of course, the irony is that probably the worst performance, or one of the two worst performances, was against the team that's currently 20th, and that's Wolves. And Jonathan Wood got in touch. He actually, he kept on writing. He was getting increasingly agitated. First of all, he sat here. He says, it's half time. I'm watching the Bodo game. All I can see is us being passive again, which follows similar performances such as Bournemouth and Wolves. He goes on to say, this is Conte Mourinho-esque mentality of dying on your knees. It's not good enough. Conte lost me at Portsmouth in the FA Cup. Ange lost me at Everton. That awful game at Goodison Park last season. And says Jonathan, Frank has already lost me at Wolves. I mean, that is a little bit harsh. But the one thing I think is clear that all fans want to see, because that's when the majority of the fans see the team up close and personal, is some, exciting, swaggering performances at home. And I think, either of you come in first here, but I think it's fair to say that he certainly hasn't worked out that conundrum yet, has he? And although, George, I think you've got a sneaking feeling as to what you think he might do, or what he might need to do to loosen the strings in N17.
Play Xavi as the 10. We saw it at Leeds. Some of those lovely passes. Maybe not the Rabona as much, but I think that was my frustration with Leeds. The fact that he didn't play Xavi as the 10, and he went again with the João Palhinha and Rodrigo Bentancur double pivot, which I personally think is fine for away games like we saw at Leeds. And I expected that at Bodo. I was a bit surprised he didn't play that at Bodo. But I think at home it needs to be a more kind of bolder and try and, a bit more of a progressive midfield.
Which of those would you, George? Which of those two would you drop if you were making more attacking?
Bentancur, 100% at the minute. I understand João Palhinha is 30, and I guess he needs to be managed. So I'm not saying he has to play every single minute. But I think against Wolves, I probably would have done Palhinha, Bergvall, and Xavi as the three. And look, if it's not working, you can bring on Bentancur and try and shore things up. But I think in that sort of home game, you've got to start on the front foot. You've got to try and be more bold. And I know Thomas Frank has mentioned a couple of times that the Wolves' first half, having watched it back, he was quite happy with it. But I just think, other than that kind of the kudos goal, which was disallowed, and a little flurry towards the end of the half, there's just not enough kind of boldness and passive is the right word from that email from Jonathan. That's kind of the the Bode and the Wolves game, there's just a real passive nature about the whole team. And look, that's not just Thomas Frank's fault. That's the whole starting lineup and the players that are playing. They also need to take accountability themselves. But I think that is an area where Marcus is right. Going forward, Thomas, we are going to need to see better home performances because we haven't really. Burnley 3-0, great result. But when you score after 10 minutes, it kind of leads itself into a bit of a comfortable afternoon. If it had been 0-0 at half time, it might be a very different story and it wouldn't be so rosy. But having said that, I think the games coming up, it's Aston Villa at home after the international break. It's then Chelsea and Man United in November back to back. These are big games. They're not games where we expect Tottenham to have 65, 70% possession. Spurs are going to be pinned back. But it's going to be kind of punch for punch. And I actually think, certainly it'll also be a little bit transitional football. And I think Tottenham, even we saw under Ange, they do have a brilliant team on the transition to counter-attack. So I think those games will actually maybe help Thomas Frank just kind of get a couple of big wins at home. And then once he's got that, this kind of talk about, the Bournemouth and the Wolves, it's not really sort of kind of relevant because you're now talking about Villa beating Villa at home. You're now talking about getting a big win against Chelsea at home or a big win against Man United. So that's what I'm kind of hoping to see over the next month, that he can get some big wins in those games. And like I said, I think the kind of two styles of playing a Villa and playing a Chelsea, I think it could work in Thomas Frank's favour actually, where there's not so much pressure on him to break a team down that's in kind of a low block.
Tom, quite a few people have written in about Xavi, and of course, understandably so. He's the big, exciting signing, and we are starting to see some glimpses. Now, Maharian has been in touch and says a super talent like Xavi Simons is never the problem. If anything, it's on the manager to get the most out of him. If a star boy like Xavi isn't producing, it is a Thomas Frank problem. So do you go down the same route as George and say he's got to play at number 10, as simple as that? Or is life not as straightforward as that for Thomas in certain situations, at least?
I'd just like to point out the previous email, Jonathan. These guys have massively changed their tune. Last week they would have been right on the same wavelength as you. But now they're saying post Leeds, they're all aboard the Frank train. But it was only a week ago they were the naysayers as well. So I have much sympathy for Jonathan in this regard. Absolutely.
Are you suggesting we are a bit fickle, Tom, or not?
I would never suggest that about you, Marcus. I think Xavi Simons, I think George is right that long term, he absolutely is number 10. He looks more comfortable centrally. I don't think he really looks comfortable out on the left. I think he sort of looks a bit lost. He sort of looks like he's kind of feels like he needs to stay out there, but actually he doesn't really believe in that position. He doesn't really sort of think that that's where he can do his best work. He sort of wants to come inside. So I think long term, he will play more centrally. I just think Frank is using this kind of period to sort of bed him in a bit. I think he wants to be a little bit sort of almost a bit smarter about it. And maybe we might say he's kind of overthinking it and just do it. But I think he wants to kind of keep the team's solidity. And there is that kind of, Frank does have that streak about him. And it sort of links to that midfield question as well about the Bentancur and Palhinha kind of axis, where I think he would say that if he took out Palhinha, even at home to Wolves, you're playing against a really good team who in the Premier League can still, beat you on the counter attack. And, we saw that many times last season where Spurs played basically without an anchor in midfield and got beaten by lower teams on the counter attack. I think there's a more of an argument perhaps for rotating Bentancur, but I also think Bentancur does things that other players don't do on the ball. Offensively, he breaks lines with his passing when he's in form. So I think basically that the Xavi Simons thing is still sort of Frank wanting to kind of keep the solidity of the side right now. But I think we're not far away from seeing him, playing in that central role more consistently. In terms of who the onus is on, to be honest, I don't think Xavi Simons has done enough in his career to be like that. I don't think he's the kind of player where you come in, he's 27, he's done it, in various big clubs and various places, and you say, well, it's sort of his team. And it's on the manager to basically, play him in his best position, and it's up to the manager to kind of let him express himself. I don't think Xavi Simons is like that. I think he's come to Tottenham, and he needs Tottenham just as much as Spurs need him. He's been a superstar talent ever since he was a a very young kid. You know, they were talking about him at Barca like he was, you know, the next big thing. He had a huge amount of hype and noise around him for a long time, you know, and he has a sort of superstar quality about him in all ways, to be honest, on and off the pitch. And he needs, I think, to sort of justify that noise. He needs to kind of basically deliver now at a proper club for a sustained period of time. You know, we've seen it in glimpses for his clubs. You know, he's been at in the last 3 or 4 years. He was the best player in the Bundesliga for the best part of a season 2 or 3 years ago. You know, and he's got it. There's no doubt about that. But I think he needs Spurs right now. You know, he's had a slightly sort of wandering year and a half. And he's come to a team now back in the Champions League, and he needs to basically prove that he is a top player at a top level, you know. And I don't think it's on Spurs and on Frank to sort of, you know, allow him to do as he pleases. I don't see that at all. I think it's a definitely a relationship where both need each other just as much, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I would agree. There's certainly in the Leeds game there have been definite touches, sparks of magic, but yeah, the last couple of years have not been great for him. I still wonder whether the physicality of the Premier League is going to be an issue, and he's surprisingly one-footed as well. But for all of that, he's got great ability, and I'm excited to see how he develops over the next few weeks. A more general question
Marcus,
comes
on that,
in.
just on the physicality thing, because I actually did a sort of quite a big piece about this a couple of weeks ago about kind of how Premier League clubs sort of look at foreign players and how they decide which ones can kind of make the transition to the Premier League. And the Bundesliga has been a hugely popular market for a long time now for Premier League clubs where they spend big money, and in part because there's this idea that the Bundesliga is the closest to the Premier League in terms of the intensity and in terms of the physicality, the sort of up and down nature of the football there. They sort of think that means that players who do well in the Bundesliga, it suggests that they might be able to cope in the Premier League. It's not to say it's a direct comparison. I think we've seen with Florian Wirtz, for example, that there is still a difference. You know, a player there who everyone expected to hit the ground running, who really hasn't. But what sort of scouts look at more and more is they'll look at sort of in La Liga and Serie A, and they'll see very good technical players, but in very kind of what they would say is organized and controlled environments. You know, that the games there in Italy and Spain tend, and it's broad sweeps, but they tend to be quite sort of tactical and slower. Whereas in the Bundesliga, you have that thing where it's a bit more of a basketball game, and you can sort of look at players and say, okay, do they have the ability? Someone said to me a bit like this, where you have to imagine the player is on his own, without support, without any players around him. Can he cope? Can he hold on to the ball? Will he be able to have the strength or the touch or the skill to be able to hold on to it and not give the ball away? And I think in the Bundesliga, they always feel there is at least a fair comparison there. And I think it's not always about size, I think is my point, you know, because someone like Xavi Simons, you look at him and you think, yeah, he's very small, he's very slight. But ultimately, if they have that ability to hold players off, or look at someone like a Modric, for example, is a very clear example, right? You know, and there are plenty of others, David Silva, Fabregas, who have that ability to basically sort of sneak through gaps, you know, because they've got kind of that low center of gravity, that very good touch. And it's not necessarily all about the sort of muscular strength, you know. And they often talk as well about, when they talk about strength, it's very specific. You know, there's one club in the Premier League who have this phrase. It's what is it? It's something like it's something about, I can't remember the phrase, but it's something about sort of the minor details of these things. So it's not about being strong. It's about where is the strength. You know, he's tall, but can he actually head it? You know, and for example, with attacking midfielders, they like to have players who have very big muscular in the lower body, in the quads, because it allows them to drive through gaps. You know, so it's not about looking like you're a big lad like, I don't know, Gareth Bale or someone who's got, you know, huge torso and upright. If you're a little player like Xavi Simons and you've got the ability in your legs to sort of drive through those gaps and to hold people off, then still it's enough. So it's just a point to say that you know, sometimes it's not just about the size; it's about where the size is, and obviously about the skill as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think he's going to be excellent. I really do. But it's a good point you make, and it perhaps explains why the likes of maybe Lo Celso and Brian Hill are rather more effective, or have been rather more effective in La Liga than the Premier League. Going back to the questions, this is a more general one from Jamie March, who says, I've been watching Spurs since the mid-1970s, and with the exception of a couple of peak Poch years, we have so often come undone against so-called lower opposition. Going back to that wretched Wolves game, I guess I don't like to call Bournemouth lower league opposition because they're excellent, and I think in Andoni Areola they've got a top-class manager, but I guess technically speaking they're not amongst the giants. And Jamie goes on to say the personnel may change, but the old frailties remain. What is it? Are we cursed? What do you reckon, George? I mean, we do have some crushing disappointments against lower league opposition, but then, of course, we have plenty of crushing disappointments against Chelsea and Arsenal and Liverpool and others as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we'd lost to Man United in the Europa League final, I think I would have said we're cursed. It's Spursy is real. It's you can't get rid of it. No, in all seriousness, I think it's partly to do with the strength of the Premier League, isn't it? I mean, I don't personally think Wolves are going to finish the season in 20th, but if we just say that they're the worst team at the minute in the Premier League, well, they're still a very good team, aren't they? Let's be totally honest. And if they, their wage bill, how much money they generally spend. I mean, I know they don't spend loads, but it's going to dwarf a lot of the other top 5 leagues in Europe. Unfortunately, you only have to look at the wages in kind of Serie A and I guess La Liga and see what the English Premier League teams are paying those guys. And I think that's partly why the level of the Premier League has just risen and risen and risen, because you've got a team like Bournemouth, as you just mentioned, Marcus, who, if they finish 7th this season, no one would be surprised, but they'd say, brilliant manager. They've sold all their back 4 in the summer, but they've replaced them brilliantly. Partly again because of the money in the Premier League. So the level is continuously going up. So no, I don't think Spurs are cursed, but I guess it kind of goes back to the original point. In those games, Spurs can't be so safe. They do need to kind of lean on the quality they have to try and make the first move and not kind of rely on set pieces and, I guess kind of bits and pieces and then you win 1-0 because you've forced more mistakes than you've made, kind of thing. But no, going back to the original, I don't think the Spurs are cursed. But actually, just going back to something that Tom said, when Tom was talking about attacking midfielders having big quads and muscles in the right areas, I just suddenly thought of John McGinn using his backside to keep hold of the ball, and now that's just kind of imprinted in my brain, and we're going to see John McGinn in a couple of weeks. So looking forward to seeing how he uses it.
Can't wait to see John McGinn in action and that Cash. I hope he's injured. I'm sorry, but there's one player I don't want to see, and that's Matty Cash, who seems to have a personal vendetta against Spurs players in particular. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk Harry Kane, some developing news with regards to the great man, some more of your excellent correspondence as well, including is an away point in the Champions League good, and also a very interesting little suggestion in terms of how the club might now be run by the Lewis family post Daniel Levy. So don't go away. Now, guys, Mark G's been in touch, or Stonefish Mark, as he likes to be called on social media. Was it good? No. Is an away point in the Champions League good? Yes. He's, of course, referring to the Bodo Clint game. And he goes on to say, remember, at the start, everyone said we'll take time, and then everyone panics at every little thing. It is early. We have key injury issues. And, of course, we really have, and we tend to forget that, which I think is a little reflection of how well Thomas Frank has done. But no Kulusevski, no Maddison, others, of course, sidelined at the moment. But Mark finishes, while Liverpool have lost their last 2 games and may be struggling a bit, we have managed draws. Hang in there. And I think that's a really good, positive message. And I know, Tom, I did speak about Dan Kulusevski recently, and I'm so excited. I want him back. I think maybe you start to take people for granted at certain times. And he was so good for most of last season. He got run into the ground in the end. But how exciting to think that he's going to come back and that hopefully Maddison will come back in time to be an influence if required. And who knows, we'll talk more about our friend Viv in a moment and the money that might be splashed in January. But I think that's the reason I'm particularly excited. There are options within the squad, and I get the feeling there are going to be even more options come early in the new year.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I mean, if you look at the squad now, you would hope that Spurs are going to be in a better place, as the months go on in this season. And I think that's a huge positive. You think that the ceiling is really there for this team to go to another level. Kulusevski is a clear one in the next sort of 2 months. Let's hope that maybe he could be back, sort of kicking balls again. Maddison a bit further away, but I would sort of more lean on the idea that Xavi Simons, we've already talked about, and Kolo Muani could really make an impact in the next 2 or 3 months. We haven't really seen that much of either of them so far. I mean, for different reasons and to different degrees. But I think if you think you're going to add Kulusevski, Kolo Muani, and Xavi Simons, a really sort of better fit and firing Xavi Simons to this team, I think that makes a huge difference. So I think from what Spurs have, and we know that they, the difficulty so far has been in attack with the creativity, and we shouldn't skip over that. If we're kind of talking about the kind of start to the season, I think the big asterisk we would all say is that the creativity hasn't really been there. They haven't really been making enough clear chances, particularly in those home games, as you guys have said. But I think there are clear mitigating factors there. Solanke's injury is a clear one. The other guy's injuries is clear. And I think Frank's answer, I buy that, the idea that this is a completely new front four. He's right that the attack that was there last season for Ange is no longer there for Frank. You've got players who are basically gelling and finding sort of the chemistry in those connections again, and it's still really early days with that regard. So, I think I agree. I think there's a huge upside for the squad generally. Was there also a kind of a point about the away, whether it's a good point in
Well, yeah, he was saying, we came back to get a point, and I know we won at Bodo Glimt in the Europa League last season, but in general terms, if you're winning your home games and picking up a point on the road, you're going to cruise into the next stage, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, last season it's 15 points, isn't it? It's 15 points to sort of get in the top 8. 5 wins basically kind of gets you there with 1 or 2 draws.
Tom, just to jump in, it's 16 points last year was sort of the golden mark, and it was a certain goal difference. There was a couple of teams that just missed out, and 15 did drop all the way down to I think kind of 13th or 14th. So I think
16 points. So it's only 5 wins and a couple of draws basically. And if you look at the Spurs fixtures they've got, I think their home games. If they look at sort of they've beaten Villarreal at home, they've got Copenhagen, Slavia Prague, and Dortmund. And they should be really looking, I think, to get like 2 or 3 wins out of those ones. And you pick up a couple more points away from home. They're nearly there. So I think, Ange had this line, didn't he? And it's a bit of an Ange line, but that any away point in Europe is a good one. You look down the fixtures in any given round, and it's pretty rare to see an away win. And I remember him saying that, and sort of going back over the last 2 or 3 rounds just to see if it was true. And actually, it kind of was. Like, it is rare to see teams, even the best teams, win away. So, and I think with that Bodo win, the Bodo draw, I think we slightly, because it was so convincing back in May, I think we all expected it perhaps to be easier than it was. I think it is a difficult place to go. It's a difficult pitch, and they're a good team, and they showed that, I think, much more this time than they did a few months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at their results, actually, they very rarely lose at home. So maybe we were a little fooled by what we did most impressively in the semi-final last season. Now, touching on what you've been saying there, Tom, about the strike force, and this can get us onto Harry Kane. Devlin434 has been in touch, and he says, short memory from our supporters. Remember, Poch took time to get his ideas across, wasn't pretty at the start. Frank has us sound defensively. Players will make mistakes from time to time. It happens. The Solanke injury, he says, is a big blow, of course. And the hold-up play in the box is an issue. Richie simply doesn't hold it up enough. He's not great in the box. And I would absolutely concur with that. We made the point after the Leeds game, George, that, for all the fine play, the ball's whizzing across the box every now and then, and you don't feel as though there is a natural goal scorer ready to take advantage. I know a natural goal scorer. His name is Harry Kane. He's been linked with a possible return to Tottenham next season. He seemed to dampen all that talk a couple of days ago, insisting that, he's still very happy in the Bundesliga. Since then, of course, we've discovered that he's picked up an injury. He's not going to play for England against Wales. What is your reading in terms of whether certainly I got maybe a little overexcited a couple of weeks ago? Because I'll say it again, for me, for Tottenham and for Kane, a return to North London next summer makes absolute sense to me, assuming as long as we're going to be in the Champions League again.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, this, isn't it? He said he's all in on Bayern Munich, didn't he? And that essentially he feels less likely to return to the Premier League right now compared to when he left, in the summer of 2023. I think, they're not great quotes to see as Spurs fans, especially about a week or so after Thomas Frank said he would more than happily welcome him back to Tottenham. The only thing I would say is Harry Kane is the absolute utmost professional. I don't think any part of him is, he's so experienced in the media. I don't think any part of him was ever going to come out and say, I really want Harry Kane. I really want Alan Shearer's record. I'm sort of eager to move back to the Premier League because he's just too professional to do that, and especially on England duty and create a whole storm before a couple of big games. So I wasn't hugely surprised to hear him say what he says. I
George,
guess where I would,
you mentioned, just to add in there, like before a couple of big games. I think the big thing there is before the World Cup. I think like there's no way that Kane wants to sort of create some sort of circus next summer going into the World Cup, which where he thinks he's hoping basically to lead the team to what will be a historic achievement. I think he knows that if he gave any kind of inkling that he was wanting to return to the Premier League, there'd be every single press conference where he was in, and he will be in a lot of pressers because he's the captain. He'll be asked about, well, Man City, or is it Chelsea, or is it Spurs? And I think he knows that for the good of his form and for the good of the team, he has to basically put a lid on it as quickly as possible.
Yeah,
yeah, I
that
agree with
makes
that
sense.
completely. The only kind of worry, I guess, from the Tottenham fan point of view, is that it was a couple of weeks ago that I said it's strange there's been no contract talks. Well, all of a sudden there's been little kind of noises from key figures at Bayern Munich saying, "Oh yeah, we definitely want to keep Harry. The relationship's going great. We're gonna sit down and talk at some point." And that kind of does indicate to me that actually, clearly and understandably, Bayern Munich don't want him to go next summer or the summer after next. They do want to keep him. Now, obviously, football is such a fluid sport. Touch wood, this doesn't happen. Harry Kane could injure himself in the next 5-6 months, and then all of a sudden, no one wants to touch him because he's mid-30s and he's just done his ACL. Or Bayern Munich have a terrible second half of the season. They sack Vincent Kompany, and the new manager comes in and doesn't want him. All these kind of scenarios that seem unlikely right now, but they could do. But I think the fact that Bayern Munich are now kind of putting out messages in the media about a new contract and wanting to speak to Harry doesn't massively support the idea that he's going to come back next summer. I do think he will. I genuinely do think he will come back to Tottenham. I just don't know when that is, and it's sort of everything that's happened over the last few days just points us in the direction that it's going to be kind of north of 2027, I'd say.
Well, I'm going to continue to cross everything, and I think he should come back sooner than that because he wants to break Shearer's record. And by the start of next season, Frank will have got everything running really nicely, and all we'll need is a regular goal scorer. Before we finish tonight, I want to ask you a bit about Vicario because he's come in for some criticism, but I have noticed some very interesting stats with regard to him. But Tom Williams has also been in touch. Says, "Dear Tottenham Way podcast, with Daniel Levy's departure, I'm curious about what the post-Levy era might look like under Vivienne, or Viv as we like to call her on this podcast, and Charlie Lewis. Joe Lewis always seemed to view Spurs mainly as an asset, but could his children, who are lifelong supporters and presumably wealthy in their own right, feel a more emotional connection? Is it realistic to think they might not sell at all, but instead run the club with genuine ambition, balancing sustainability with on-pitch success? And if so, could this new era of ENIC ownership actually turn out to be the best outcome for Spurs fans? Well, we know there have been a couple of supposed approaches since Daniel Levy left. They have been rebuffed for now. Mr. Allnutt, what is your take on the ownership situation?
I mean, I think that's what they would be very keen to stress at this point. They're very keen to stress that that there is a really strong emotional connection there, and that they want to basically focus on making this a successful sporting project as well as a successful financial one. That's been all the noises that we've heard in the first few weeks. I think they have been making the right gestures, let's say. You know, they've been at the games, been very visible. Frank has said that they've been visible around the club, that he's had I think he's sort of had 2 or 3 conversations with them. You know, I think he's had sort of some good talks with them as well. And he has definitely kind of, you know, said all the right lines. Frank, I mean, to be honest, I don't think he could really say anything else, but he's said, you know, all the right lines about them being, what was it, 110% invested, I think was the quote. 110% committed, I think was the quote. I think, you know, at this point, all of that, I have to say, is kind of expected. You know, I wouldn't expect them to say anything different at this point. I think really, you know, Tom Williams' question is kind of the question we're all wondering. You know, and we're only going to know by the actions, because ultimately, you know, his actions speak louder than words, isn't it? And that is going to come from the January transfer window. It's going to come, I think, more significantly next summer. It's probably going to be a bit harsh to judge them on January the 31st if, you know, Spurs have only made a couple of signings and say, well, this is the same old, same old. I think the big one will be next summer. It'll be in the contract renewals. It will be in that wage to revenue ratio, and whether or not, you know, Spurs at 42%, bottom of the Premier League, climb up that sort of table and have a more, let's say, ambitious wage spend in the next 2 or 3 years. I think all these things, you know, remain to be seen. And it's a slightly boring answer because maybe people want to know right now, you know, right here, how it's going to look. But ultimately, you know, it's going to be, you know, what they actually do, isn't it, rather than what they say. But the early signs are good. I mean, we were in Bodo and we you know, we were walking to a pizza restaurant for lunch, and we saw Vinay and and the Lewises and Nick Buka walking around Bodo. I should say that we were actually ahead. Me and Tom Barkley were ahead, about to go into the restaurant, and actually it was Ali Gold who was straggling behind because he had been holding us up, and we agreed to go ahead and to look for to sort out lunch, basically sort out his lunch essentially. And he was straggling behind, and he happened to bump into the sort of whole of the Tottenham board on the streets of Bodo. So I mean, that is just, you know, how it goes, isn't it? Sometimes it's how the cookie crumbles.
Yeah.
You know, you do someone a good deed, and they end up sort of, you know, getting the crucial conversation. But they were there, and they were sort of wandering about, and they were mixing with the fans. So I think, as I say, I think the early signs are good. But let's see how it pans out in the next few months.
Okay, and I hope you showed them your library, which you're so proud of, out in Bodo as well, once
I
you'd
didn't
had your
get to the
pizza
library actually this
lunch.
time, Marcus. I was sampling
Oh,
other
I'm sorry
areas.
to
I
hear
know I
that.
was also disappointed not to go. It was a shame. But
George, I'm going to bring you in because I know you wear your heart close to your sleeve when it comes to our former manager. We did do a poll, an Ange poll, over the past few days, and thank you very much for the numerous votes that came in. Basically, it was, is he a legend or out of his depth as a manager at the highest level? And 46% of you decided that he's a legend. 54% said out of his depth. And I must say, when I set that, I thought that there would be a much bigger swing towards those who consider him to be out of his depth. Couple of Nottingham Forest games have taken place since that poll, so maybe that percentage has changed a little bit. But look, I don't want to be too harsh on the guy. But Mike Toddy, 7944, has been in touch, guys. He says the sooner comparisons between Thomas Frank and Ange Postecoglou stop, the better. Let's think Pochettino and Frank. It started slowly, players developed, he signed his own players, and we had a team that could give a game to anyone. Ange lovers will argue about trophies, but if we are grown up about it, there is no comparison to being able to watch your team without embarrassment and anger running through your veins every game. So we see where Mike is coming from, and a lot of others come from that area as well. George, what do you have to say about this thorny subject?
I'm glad that we've done a spoiler alert, and it was Marcus that put this poll out. It wasn't it wasn't anyone else.
You'd have
I'm
nothing to do
sure
with it. I know that.
I'm sure the ex followers were well aware. Yeah, I mean, I think Mike's spot on actually, and I think it's probably a good kind of message and bit of advice to to us guys, to fans as well. You know, there's no point comparing what Ange is doing now and what Frank's doing now. I think from one point of view, I don't think if Ange fails at Forest and he gets sacked after 7 games, that it's validation that that was the same thing would have happened at Tottenham, because he's in a completely different environment, completely different players. Thomas Frank also had a horrendous start at Brentford. I think I was looking at early, lost 6 of his first 7 when he took over at Brentford. I mean, it was 8 of his first 10 he lost, 1 win in his first 10. If they'd got rid of him at that point, they've missed out on arguably, if not the best manager in the history, but one of the best. So 7 games is just way too early to judge. But I think the wider point should be, we do need to stop comparing Frank to Ange, and Ange's team could attack really well, but they couldn't defend. But Frank's team can defend really well, but they can't attack it. It's just, we're in the present. Let's move forward. And I do actually, I can certainly, Tom mentioned it earlier with Thomas Frank pushing Matthias Tell forward at Leeds away and letting him get that moment with the away fans. And that really did remind me of Pochettino, actually, seeing him doing that. And I think, I guess that's kind of the thing that we all probably want to see with Thomas Frank, in the sense of, whether you're happy he was appointed or not, we all now hope he's going to be the next Pochettino and he's going to be the Tottenham manager for the next 4 or 5 years, because at the end of the day, if he is, then he's doing a good job. As much as Spurs, I think, have probably been too trigger happy under Daniel Levy, and some of these guys probably did deserve longer. They've all been sacked for a reason, because they are failing from what Daniel Levy / the club wanted. Pochettino was there for 5.5 years and gave us all some brilliant memories. So, and he started poorly as well, actually. We all remember how kind of close it felt like he was gonna go, wasn't he, until we got that Aston Villa win, Harry Kane off the bench. So I guess if we compare Frank's start to how Pochettino started, then he's doing a much better job. But I just think that's kind of, I think we probably do need to stop the Ange comparisons, just because it's too close together, and there's just never going to be anything really constructive with that. People are going to say either you're Ange in or you're Ange out, or you're Frank in, you're Frank out, and it's just a little bit too close and a bit too raw, I think, to really have a fair comparison between those two.
Can I say, and I think it sounds a bit brutal, but I think Ange not doing well at Forest, I think it helps Frank. I've got to say, like, I think if Forest had got off to an absolute flyer, and won 6 out of 6, and they were playing brilliant football, and everyone at Forest was singing Ange songs, then I think a lot of Spurs fans would maybe have been looking on those performances against Wolves and Bodo, and there would have been a slightly more kind of sour atmosphere about them. I think it just sort of helps everyone sort of move on. It helps people kind of feel like it was perhaps the right decision. I don't know. I'm sure there are loads of Spurs fans who still don't think it was the right decision, but I think it at least kind of gives perhaps a bit more closure, in that sense. I really like the Pochettino comparison. I hadn't really struck me, actually, but one thing that I was just sort of thinking there as George was talking, that there is also a sort of a similarity. I remember when Poch came in 2014, he was very much kind of like at the forefront of that kind of coaching zeitgeist, of the sort of pressing, running hard, fitness and physicality being, right at the forefront of it. And I think there's something similar now with Frank, in the idea of sort of set pieces and long throws and direct football again, making the most of the kind of marginal gains of the game. And we're seeing that all over the Premier League. And it's not to say that Frank invented it, just as much as Poch didn't invent pressing. But I think there's this real sense that Frank is kind of at the tip of that curve. He's right there in terms of the managers who are really relevant right now and doing the stuff that everyone is sort of trying to do more of, rightly or wrongly, whether fans like it or not. He is. And the other thing I would just say about Poch is I'm really reminded of how that team that he took over in 2014, I've just got it up here, Lloris, Kabul, Rose, Norton, Dyer, Bentaleb, Lennon, Capu, Lamella, Eriksson, Adebayor. It was nothing like the team that ended up being the kind of defining Poch side, right? And in that first season, it took Poch, 1 or 2 years really to kind of move out. It wasn't just about moving in; it was about moving out players that he didn't want, that didn't fit his system. And it's entirely possible and basically very probable that Frank right now is dealing with at least, half a dozen players who he probably thinks long-term are not the right players for him. They probably don't fit his system. They probably don't fit his kind of the sort of personality type maybe that he wants in his squad. and maybe in 2 or 3 years, this team is basically unrecognisable from the one that we saw play against Leeds United at the weekend. So when we sort of think about managers needing time, I think there's always that sense of transition. They're dealing with a squad that isn't theirs. And that's why I think, there should be positivity that as Frank stays and as the team kind of gets more used to him and the other way around, that it's hopefully going to get better and better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just to
And
jump in there, I think something that I was actually going to mention, when, you're right, Tom, Pochettino did have to get rid of certain players. And there was a point where he made the call that the seniors were not doing it and we need to go with the younger guys. And that was when Mason, Harry Kane, Eric Dyer, I guess, as well, all those guys got their opportunity. And then eventually, Dele Alli further down the line. I do wonder if at some point, maybe not this season, maybe it's too early, but I do wonder if at some point Thomas Frank is almost going to have that kind of same dilemma and that same battle. Does he go with Bentinck or does he go with Archie Gray? Even up front, it might be a case of does he go with Richarlison? Does he go with Matisse Tell? Maybe we're seeing that already with Wilson Odobert. He's sort of backing Odobert, and all of a sudden he's not really, backing Brennan Johnson. And Brennan Johnson's not an old player, but when you look at who's got the bigger potential, you say Wilson Odobert does. And I think that's something I do actually like with Frank. He's those younger players. He's already using them really well. Archie Gray is really, it already feels like he's kind of developed quite a lot over these last few months. I think we'd say the same for Matisse Tell, the last couple of performances we've seen. And again, Wilson Odobert, he's not setting the world alight. But when I actually watched back that Leeds game, there was so many really good actions. He played an unbelievable ball down the line, for a chance that I think it was Destiny Udogie ran around the back and Spurs probably should have scored from. We're already seeing that kind of coaching and that kind of development that we always told about that Frank did at Brentford. It's already coming into fruition quite early on. So that's something, that I think we all could be really, really pleased with. And Frank himself deserves a lot of credit because there's a real young nucleus in this squad, exactly the same as Pochettino had. And we saw the journey that squad went on. And if Frank can continue harnessing that and give these guys opportunities, and probably at some point back them over the ones that are sort of underperforming, then the future really could be very bright.
yeah, there's one other position that I want to ask you about in just a moment that hopefully Thomas Frank won't have to wrestle with too much. Should just say with regards to Ange, final word about Ange. As badly as he started at Nottingham Forest, let's remember he had a brilliant start to his Tottenham career and then it tailed off. So, for all the negativity that I've been guilty of with regards to him, I do hope that he starts to turn it around and who knows, maybe he's just going to have a complete reverse in terms of the way his fortunes pan out at Nottingham Forest as opposed to Tottenham. Now, I think I might say that it's Vicario's 29th birthday as we record this podcast. He has come in for some criticism this season. I mean, there were patches of last season as well, and then of course he got injured. And Kinsey did very well to begin with, but I think you start to realise after a while, as I've said this before, you have your best games when you're on the bench or not playing. And I like Vicario. I'm going to say that here and now. I like him. I know that he's like all goalkeepers, there's an error in him and that he was fragile from set pieces and that sometimes he looks like a bit of a bully. I've said this before to some of the younger players around him while not saying anything to his more experienced campaigners. I was given some stats today. I have to confess, I am not sure where they originate from. But according to these stats, Vicario, goals prevented, this is, in the Premier League, first place. Save percentage, first place. Touches, first. Passes completed, first. Short passes completed, first. Now, as I say, I can't back those stats up, but I can't imagine someone's just sat down and decided to put them on social media when they're absolute nonsense. The bottom line for me is that I think he's a good goalkeeper, and I'm surprised that as many fans that I've heard from are complaining about him. I mean, Tom, George, is this an issue? Is this an area that Frank needs to look at closely, or is Vicario the long-term answer?
I think those are two different questions, actually. I think long-term answer, perhaps not. But I think, is it an issue right now? Not in my opinion. I think there are other issues at Spurs that are more pressing than the goalkeeper at the moment. I still think they haven't nailed that wide forward position. Maybe they will. Maybe this season, one of those guys is going to really emerge. But I still think that's an area where Spurs haven't got the kind of game changer player right now. Up front is a problem area at the moment. Although that is partly because of Solanke's injury. When he comes back, maybe that gets solved. I still think in defence they lack a bit of cover in certain areas. So in my opinion, it's a bit of a luxury problem. I think Vicario is generally very good. Yes, he does have mistakes in him. I didn't think he was very good in the Europa League final, I have to say. And it was a big night, and I didn't think he had a great game, particularly in that first half. But he does make really good saves, and those stats, if correct, and I might just quickly try and check them when George comes in, are really impressive. And I'm particularly surprised about the short passes one, to be honest. When people talk about Frank's team being more direct and and going more long ball, that clearly suggests that Spurs are still building out from the back. In 4 or 5 years, do I expect Vicario still to be Tottenham's goalkeeper? To be honest, maybe not. If he doesn't progress, if he doesn't sort of go to another level, then I can imagine that Spurs might get to a position where they think that they can get someone better. But that's a lot of ifs there, I mean, 29 is still young for a goalkeeper. At 32, 33, with another 2 or 3 years of Premier League experience, Vicario could be a really, really good goalkeeper at that point. So I think that's a long way ahead. I personally don't think it's a priority problem right now they have to solve. But I don't know, George, you agree with that?
Yeah, that would be my summarisation. That for the next 2 years, I don't see why Spurs should be looking to spend money on a new goalkeeper when Vicario has proven to be a very good goalkeeper with the odd rookie in him. But he's also got that kind of he's only 28, isn't he? I think so. He's actually at an age where he's kind of coming into his peak as a goalkeeper. It's funny, Marcus. I was actually sent those stats earlier today. It's from Data MB, which is quite a well-known data site, and 109,000 followers. So it seems pretty legit to me. I guess just on Vicario, Tottenham have got a new goalkeeper coach, Fabian Otter, who was at Liverpool previously, and I think he might have been at RB Leipzig before that. I was talking to somebody in the summer actually about him, and it sounds like he's kind of a little bit of a revolutionary as a goalkeeper coach. He come in to Liverpool and is kind of somebody that I know quite well that works at Spurs now, that works with him, was saying generally goalkeepers they train the same way. It's catch crosses, you sit on the floor, you do your save. It's all very kind of run of the mill stuff, and he's kind of started to revolutionise training and make it more specific to game scenarios. He's very, very big on his data, and if you look at kind of the structure that the coaching structure at Tottenham now, there's lots of different departments. They've got a head of methodology. They've got different people bridging gaps. I mentioned Stuart Lewis a couple of weeks ago. He's kind of the under 21 bridge as part of the first team of bringing guys in, and I'm really intrigued actually to see kind of early on. It's only 2 months in with Vicario. I'm not expecting to see massive improvements in it at the minute, but I'm really interested to see how much he will actually improve under Fabian, especially if he's as highly rated as I was kind of being told in the summer. And I think in terms of the short passes, doesn't massively surprise me actually that he's first, because if you think about the long passes that Tottenham are playing, it's not actually normally him that's playing them. It's Pedro Porro's played some brilliant long passes, and Christian Romero played that brilliant long pass for Lucas Bergwall to score at West Ham. So it's actually not often Vicario that plays the real long pass. And I'm thinking, I don't know what game it was, but I remember Mickey van der Ven taking a goal kick and just absolutely hammering it kind of 75 yards down the pitch. So I think that is an area where Vicario needs to improve. His short passing isn't the best. We do see him knocking out of play from time to time, but I think on the whole, those stats do kind of back up the point I was trying to make the other day, that shot stopping wise, he's a brilliant shot stopper and one of the best in the Premier League. And I think for now, he's certainly not a problem for Spurs. And I don't think he will be, at least for the next couple of seasons, I'd say.
Yeah, and of course he's a key part of a defence that has only conceded 5 goals in 7 Premier League games, and he kept a clean sheet in the first of the Champions League games at home as well. Guys, I think that more or less covers our assessment. You've both gone for 8 out of 10 in terms of your early season report. Mr. A's got his hand up. One more comment from you, sir?
I was just wondering what people sort of, on the basis of what we've seen the first couple of months, has anyone kind of changed their expectations of where Spurs will finish? Marcus, why don't you go? We've done a lot of talking. What did you think at the beginning of the season and after? Well, we've been, is it 2 months now? How do you feel
Yeah.
now? And where do you think Spurs can go this season?
Yeah, sorry, that's a very good question. And I meant to throw it out earlier myself. Um, at the start of the season, I thought that we could get 5th place, which might be enough for the Champions League. And I still certainly think we can get 5th place. I actually think we can do better than that. I'm worried about the lack of a genuine goal scorer. That's my problem. And maybe Kolo Muani, when he ever gets over this dead leg, is going to come back and be the answer. And Solanke, of course, has been missed as well. I like Richarlison, and I'm glad that he's fit. And I think he's working his socks off. But I don't know what his goal scoring record is. George will probably have the stats. It's not the answer. And I'm not trying to make a comparison with Harry Kane, because no one can be compared with Harry Kane. But we are lacking that out and out goal scorer. And unless that gets resolved, I'm still loath to get too carried away. But I genuinely think that Spurs can qualify for the Champions League, and I really think they can have a good run in one of the cup competitions as well. So that's what I'm sticking with. Georgie boy, do you agree?
As good a start as it's been, I'm not sure if my kind of expectations have massively changed.
Still tetchy.
Started down in the dumps. We can do the treble. Let's go for it. No, I think maybe my expectations have risen slightly. I think before Xavi Simons and Kolo Muani come in, and Kolo Muani's been an absolute not a good signing so far, but he's got a few months to prove us all right, because I thought he was going to be very good. Before those two guys come in on deadline day, I was a little bit down on the kind of quality of the squad, and especially the depth of the squad. And I was thinking Spurs were going to be somewhere between 6th and 8th. I think the top 5 and maybe the top 4 is definitely on. I really thought those top 4 teams, being Liverpool, Arsenal, Man City, and Chelsea, would be nailed on for the top 4, and maybe they will. But there certainly seems a few kind of cracks certainly in Chelsea, and Man City have obviously started slowly, and Liverpool, losing a lot of games. So I certainly think Spurs are definitely in the mix for top 4, top 5. I guess my reservations come from probably the fact that we're approaching the crunch and the difficult times. How is Thomas Frank going to be able to handle that? I've got more belief that he will be able to handle that period well, but I worry about the squad. The squad, there has already been injuries, in the squad. I mean, I know some of them were, pre Thomas Frank, Maddison, Kulusevski, Dragusin. But on top of that, Solanke's injury, the way that's played out has been a concern. Ben Davies was injured for a week or so. Obviously, Romero's missed 1 game. And as much as I am very looking forward to seeing Dejan Kulusevski back in a Tottenham shirt, I've got low expectations when he does come back, just because of the way it takes players to build up injuries. And it's the same for James Maddison, to be honest. I don't expect to see Maddison at all, really, in a Tottenham shirt this season, not anywhere near the level. And Kulusevski, I think, is going to need a couple of months to get up to speed. So I don't think those guys are going to come in and really affect this season as much as we would like. So the squad as it is, I think they could probably, I think Thomas Frank could probably find a way for 5th, but that's on the basis that he doesn't go really deep in one of the cup competitions, because if Spurs have got Champions League, FA Cup when it comes to March time, as well as big Premier League games, I think he's going to struggle to make the changes that he's going to need to make, and for the level of the team to be the level it needs to be winning those games. So I think Spurs probably can get 5th, but I'm not that optimistic that it's going to be fifth and a good cup run. I think it's going to be either a good cup run and maybe sixth or seventh, or it's going to be out of the cups early and they're going to come fifth. So not massively hopeful of both. I'd love an FA Cup win in fifth, but I don't quite think the squad's there for it yet.
Yeah, well, obviously the draw away to Newcastle in the League Cup is not great. Just going back actually before you come in, Tom, I think George is right. When you look at the next set of fixtures, I think we'll be able to answer that question much better by the time his former club Brentford come to Tottenham on the 6th of December, because between now and then, which is what effectively exactly 2 months, isn't it? So as George rightly said, we got Villa after the international break, then we go to Monaco, then away to Everton. And we were talking earlier about struggling against lesser opposition and how terrible we were at Everton last season. So that's going to be an awkward game. Newcastle in the League Cup, well, I don't think they're as good as they were last season, so yeah, it's a possibility. Then, of course, Chelsea at home, Copenhagen United at home, away to Arsenal, away to PSG, then Fulham at home, then Newcastle away again in the league, and then that Brentford match. So I stand by what I've said. I think top five and a really good cut run, but I might have changed my mind by the first week in December.
I thought you were
Frank
going to
out
say
already.
Yes,
I thought you were going to say you
where's
might have
Ange?
changed your mind in the last 5 minutes, Marcus. I thought you just sort of was talking there, you'd been to talk yourself out of it.
Well, George's negativity did slightly, concern me because he's normally very positive. I'm not going to get dragged down. Such a tetchy fellow, isn't he?
Yeah, his vibe is kind of seeping into all of us, hasn't it? Yeah, that's the problem. To be fair,
Well,
I think I sort of broadly agree with George. I think he covered it there. I think I was sort of thinking early in the season, maybe sort of top seven, might get sort of sixth or seventh. I sort of thought they'd maybe probably finish Europa League, maybe with the squad they had. I think now they can finish fifth, and I think part of that is the way they're playing. But I also think, to be honest, a big part of it is you look at the rivals. You think about Villa, Newcastle, Man United. All of them are. I mean, pretty much all of them bottom half of the table. I think. And all got big problems as it stands. You might even think that Bournemouth, Palace, are going to be, just as much competition for that fifth spot this season, maybe as those other ones. So I think I sort of think the top four is going to be very hard to break into to get into those four teams. But I think fifth is wide open for a side like Spurs, definitely.
yeah, reasons to be optimistic. Come on, George. Uh, Now that's just about it for this edition. But next week it's a Tom Barkley special, a draft special, the Daniel Levy years. And we are going to try and, well, it's Tom's baby, this, but we have to come up with the best possible 11. Look at the great signings. I'm going to throw in a few: Berbatov, Robbie Keane, Rafael van der Vaart, Luka Modric. Son was signed, of course, during that era. And then knowing George just being a bit negative, he'll probably have Raziak up front. Davinson Sanchez in the heart of his defence, Vincent Janssen ready to come off the bench, Roberto Soldado certain to miss another opportunity, and he's probably going to have Ndombele as his captain. But we're going to have a bit of fun with this. A lot of players to choose from, and obviously 24 years of highs and lows. So looking forward to sinking my teeth into that one. I'm going to throw one question at both of you straight away, just straight off the cuff. Name the best signing in the Levy era. George Sessions.
Got to be Gareth Bale, I think, hasn't it? I don't think it can be anything else. What was he signed for? 16 million, sold for
10,
100
apparently.
million, and it gave us a couple of unbelievable seasons. I know he had a tough start, but yeah, that last season, which would have been what, 12, 13, I think off the top of my head, was just I went to a lot of those games. I feel like I was behind the goal for a lot of those games. Top corner, top corner, top corner every time, wasn't it, with that left foot? Yeah, I'd go with Gareth Bale.
I'm tempted. It's either Hyunmin Song or Clinton Ng. No, it's got to be Clinton. I mean, Sonny's got to be up there. I checked his record: 173 goals in 454 appearances. Bale 71 in 237. Of course, two spells at the club. My vote's got to go to Son. Tommy A, what about you?
I remember your team last time, Marcus. What was it? We did the early 2000s, didn't we? And you had you had some stinky players in your team.
I did.
I've got to
I
say.
did.
Ben
I,
Thatcher. Don't tell
I
me
had,
Ben Thatcher was in there.
yeah, he probably was. I had plenty to choose from. That's the bottom line.
It was a really poor side that Marcus ended up with, I have to say. My favourite signing was Modric, definitely. I think the best signing was Van der Vaart, because I think it was a game changer for Spurs. It was the one that I think got everyone really excited. It was the one that it was sort of in the old era of transfers where things sort of came out of the blue more. And I think that was the one that everyone was like, wow, we've signed a player there.
Well, some names, and Lloris. I mentioned Berbatov, Robbie Keane, Jermaine Defoe.
Berbatov.
Anyway,
Oof,
I
what a player.
love Berbatov. Love Berbatov, especially at home. He's sometimes checked out a little on some of the tougher away games, but what a player! What technique! Anyway, we will be in the hands of Tom Barkley next week. He'll explain how it all works, so don't miss that. But thank you very much, Steve. As I said at the start of the show, your contributions, your emails, your messages, and everything else are fantastic. We are at the Tottenham Way on X, aren't we? We're on Insta and YouTube. Tom Allnutt's very good when it comes to all the housekeeping, but we just love to hear from you. Criticism, preferably not, but if necessary, and thoughts. And there'll be another international break in a few weeks, won't there, of course?
And on email, it's the tottenhamwaypod@gmail.com. So keep them coming, keep the emails coming, because we really appreciate all of them.
Fantastic. Listen, Tom, thank you. That's Tom Allnutt from the Times, George Sessions from the Press Association. I am Marcus Buckland, and we're happy, even if occasionally we weren't as happy as we should have been. He's just a little bit tetchy. That's George. Come on, you Spurs.